Welcome to the East Bay DSA's Capital Class lecture number 3. And we're broadcasting here again from the Democratic Socialists of America Center in Oakland. And thanks for everyone also who's joining us, from other places. Okay. So I just want to, I'm going to do most of the time, if this working. I wanted to situate where we are. So most groups, I think, will have read chapters 1, 2, and 3 at this point. If you haven't done that, you're a little behind, which is totally fine. If you're somehow onto chapter 4, you're a little ahead, which is also totally fine. But in general, I'm planning it so that people have a chance to sort of talk through the material before getting it sort of lectured through. And I think that's the right way to do it. So hopefully people can keep a little ahead of the lectures. We are going to be reading faster from here on out. You already sort of saw that with chapter 3. I think there's a heavier reading week, and that is going to continue. So we've picked up from chapter 1 slow times to 30 to as much as 50 pages a week. Some of those 50-page weeks are going to be, though, like the parts of Marx where there's a lot of tables and detailed historical information. So, if you really need to skim through some of that, you always can. Okay. And then also, like each time, I'm going to just keep this slide alive and say, the discussion groups are really a key part here. I just wanted to, well, let me check again. Raise your hand here in the room if you're consistently going to a discussion group. Okay, that's like 90%. Cool. Yeah, if you want to stay through the book, you really do have to be consistent with the group. That's been my experience. I think that's been a lot of people's experience. So I'll just say it again. And, our group's been meeting every week. It's been helpful. It's been great to see some people here and around. And I just want to give a shout out to everyone who's meeting consistently, because it's hard to keep that group together, and it's a lot of reading, and it's a huge book. And it seems like it's going really great with most, and then a couple, have lost some. Everyone's lost some people. That's how it happens. A couple have lost more than some, but are also working it out, which is great. So I think that's really good work, and that's like the real work of the class. So appreciate you all. And then just in terms of those groups, every week, remember to, pick someone for reminders, do rotating facilitation, don't let it all fall on one person. Remember to stick to the reading, not to bring in, something that just you've read to explain to others, but to stick to things that everyone's read and we can refer to the text and that sort of thing. And to just keep the vibes good, be kind. Okay. And then last, I wanted to situate us a bit in this way I've been doing for a couple lectures now, which is using the onion metaphor. So, at the very beginning, you could think of Marx as building layers on his argument. And in that first lecture, we covered chapter 1, section 1. In the next lecture, we covered the rest of chapter 1. In this lecture, we're covering chapters 2 and 3. And in a sense, that's a whole nother layer on top of these first two. And so that's what we're doing now. He is going to start shifting it up a little more dramatically as we go forward. You could still think of it as layers, but also we're shifting realms or perspectives. So that's going to be fun. Okay. Jump into it. The exchange process, chapter 2. And for this one, I thought about how to present it, and I decided I wanted to start with that historical narrative and then sort of just go into some of the key points of the chapter. So that's sort of what I'm going to do. And I'll start with a quote that came up in my group and probably some of you others discussed as well, which is just this quote: "Commodities are things, and thus defenseless against people. If they are unwilling to belong to someone, that person can use force. In other words, simply take them." And I just want to relate this back to the idea we just covered in the last lecture, which is fetishism, right? We just covered this idea that, in a sense, right? Commodities are just things. And if they have powers over us, it's not their own powers, but it's our human social powers that have somehow been placed somewhere else. And so this is sort of where Marx is, in a sense, starting this chapter, right? He's saying, well, people are the ones who ultimately are determining society. Commodities are just things. So how did it come about that when people acting, exerting their own wills, this system came about where commodities sort of have power over people? And so that's sort of an early framing, and he's sort of starting from, well, let's go back to the defetishized, you could say, beginning of people and their own wills. Um, so if people have will over objects, what does that mean for the development of exchange and of commodities? I would say that's sort of this opening question. And I'm going to say Marx basically, this is my own stages, but talks through some stages of the development of exchange historically. So he notes that, in many places um, outside pre-capitalist, you could say, there's just minimal and somewhat random exchange of products occurring at the edges of communities. That's like a huge chunk of human history. Then, in many places, there is exchange of products. It's an early social process. There's often local forms of money, even sometimes some gold money or coins of some form. But exchange is needed to meet some local needs, some basic needs, but it's still limited within society. Um, and then three, which is the world we live in, right? Exchange bursts its local bonds. It's fully commodity exchange for the first time. Gold money appears. The concepts we've developed, abstract labor, socially necessary labor time, come into play truly for the first time. And production occurs for exchange. And most people are dependent on exchange for all their needs. So it's these sort of stages of the development of exchange. And I want to walk through this and draw a little bit from anthropology, which I am no expert in myself, so I'll caveat with that. Um, but just noting, I'm going to just pull some examples from anthropology that's happened since Marx's time. These are not in the book itself. I'm just bringing them to bear in a sense, and just talk a little bit about these three steps. And so in stage one, really, like I feel like the idea Marx is trying to get across is we used to live differently. And this is an idea I'll say personally, right? I found it very easy to understand and agree with, but I actually don't think I really understood it the first time I said that. It took some time to really be like, oh, what does it mean to like actually live in a different way, and what would that entail? Um, I did want to pull this example from the Trobriand Islanders, which maybe if anyone studied anthropology, they probably know. It's um, Malinowski wrote on it, Marcel Mauss, Annette Wiener. There's a number of big books on this. But basically, these are people who live in the islands, the Pacific Islands around New Guinea. And they used to live basically in these villages. You can see a picture of one here um, that were divided into sort of separate sections, but basically each village had collective storage of the things that are useful. There's the large yam houses. They had sort of collective living in these small sections, and then an open plaza for political work, debate, these sorts of things. So within that village, people were exchanging things, people were doing work, not in any way like commodity exchange, right? In fact, if you had a need, you could go to the common storage. Labor was just organized in the plaza together as like, what do we need to do today? These sorts of things. There's a little bit more of that directness that we talked about and that immediacy. And then even outside that village, and this is what really caught the anthropologist's eye, you could say, there's actually exchange between all these villages across this whole area of Pacific Islands, which is that map there. And even that is regulated outside of the rules of commodity exchange. It's regulated according to the logic of the gift, which is what a number of these books are sort of looking at. So basically, there's these sets of ceremonial bracelets and necklaces working with shells. And, you know, by giving these around and cycling them around, both one of them clockwise, one of them counterclockwise, they basically guarantee subsistence trade between all these different islands. And right, a lot of islands are different. Some you can farm on, some you can't, some are more difficult. And so this is actually a very important economic element of that whole way of living. But in this case, both within the community, there's very little sort of exchange at all. And then even to the extent they're doing something like exchange right at the border of the community, it's actually very socially regulated, right? There's significant laws about how it's done. And you can imagine people who are living in this would be totally confused if they walked into our world or really almost anywhere in the modern world today. Um, and so I just want to pick a couple more examples, even though I'm not going to go into them. But if you want want to look more, right? The Iroquois are an interesting example. There's been a number of writings on them. This is just a picture of the Longhouse, but they used to live in these large sort of matrilineal, you could jokingly call them sort of public housing centers where, families up to 60, even maybe more, 100 people would live in one big place and communally work. Um, and then the other one I picked here is sort of the Andean. So this is like around the time of the Incan Empire. A lot of these communities that basically are living and working in small collective communal ways. And most of the work and the things they're doing are framed, sort of in a sort of, you could say, a more spiritual register, right? It's like, what do I need to do for the family? What do I need to do for the land? And that's how they see a lot of their activity. So the very way they're acting and what they're thinking about when they're doing it is so different than how we think and act, when we go to work or when we think about work. Um, and so I just sort of wanted to use these examples to frame, right? Like there are these many cases of people living quite differently. And like I said in the last lecture, that doesn't mean you can't find cases where that's quite brutal. There are many of those too, but you can also find many cases where it's, in a sense, quite nice, or you could imagine it being nice. Um, and so I'll just want to jump ahead from there, but that's right, this sort of community with something like exchange happening on the edge, but that exchange itself is not really commodity exchange like we've been talking about it, right? It's always socially regulated in some form. And that's actually what we see if we look a little deeper at that Incan situation, is that there are early forms of exchange in money. And in fact, these sort of textiles are often treated as a parallel to money. And they would be stored, they'd be used to sort of buy labor from others, they'd be used to pay tribute, they'd be used to sort of enforce trade between communities if you had a need, but nothing to give other than these textiles. And so they were some early form of money, but that was actually sort of contained within the larger Incan Empire, right? And a structure over how this exchange happened. Um, and so that's in a sense just an extension on what I said before, but you see this early form of exchange developing that's often a minor and a socially controlled process. And you see this in a lot more detail or a lot more fullness, I would say, in different places than the ones I've used so far. The classic example Marx uses is normally like the European medieval town, and you have the guild systems there, right? Heavily regulated market exchange, markets, but there's guilds, there's all sorts of institutions controlling how that exchange happens and what runs there. But I just wanted to draw some examples from other places in the world. So here's a picture from China in the 12th century, picture of a market, similar there, right? All sorts of market exchange, the same sort of urban markets, people coming, trading, there's even currency. But all that within the Chinese empire that exists at that time and sort of a larger set of social rules. And same with Sahel towns around the same time. So there's a lot of trade. This is sort of, Southern Sahara, a lot of trade in salt, in gold, in different types of food. And these are traded in these sort of organized markets. Pictures the market on the Gold Coast. But these are within sort of larger social organizations, often based on, political systems, kin-based networks, these sorts of things, and sort of under an elite and religious control, similar to the feudal system in medieval Europe, similar to the example I just gave in China. So right, this is this early form of exchange. You see markets, literally, you could walk into a market, people are using money, they're trading, but it's confined as like a minor part of society. And if anyone was looking at the society as a whole, they would not say, to understand it, we need to look and understand this market, right? The market's this subsidiary part. And for most of the people living in that society, they may only actually trade. I mean, I'm thinking of the peasant here, for example. They may trade for 10% of their needs or less, right? Trade is not a predominant part of how they think about getting what they need. It's not part of their life. And so this is this early form of the development of exchange. And we now live in a totally different world, right? I mean, that's just want to frame that. When we look around, I think I did this exercise before, but right, everything we see basically in this room is a commodity. Everything you see in your home is a commodity. Even the building, in a sense, is a commodity that we're renting. It's all built through this logic. And we're sort of living in this world in which, all the sort of food here you can see as a commodity. Even that building you can see through the window is a commodity, was built for money, you know? And so we live in a world where nearly everything is exchanged, and we're sort of drowned in that, and it's hard to see outside of that and imagine outside of that. And so I just encourage you, if you're having trouble, to see like, oh, well, but I see what Marx is saying, but like, isn't that just how the world works? To like take some time with this idea and think through it and be like, okay, I see sort of why he's saying there's this change or this shift here. Um, and then I do want to just note that Marx says this explicitly, and I want to bring it up, right? That the concepts we've built up so far, specifically, I'll just call it, the content and the form of value, these are only really things that apply in that third stage. If you're in that second stage where 90% of what most people, produce and use is their own labor, their own work, like a peasant, there is not money as a form of value that represents all abstract labor. Like these things just are not true, right? There's not, even though there's a sense in which the logic you could say is like hiding underneath, it's just not actually true. It's not present in the society in the same way. Um, and so that's the little historical development there. Hopefully we'll use that. I'm not going to just get back to Marx, solid Marx in the book itself. Um, and wanted to talk a little bit about, when commodity exchange is the dominant form of social relations, what else must be true? And this is sort of what he goes through a little bit in that process of exchange chapter, I think. Um, and so first, he makes a note that we've talked about a bit before, which is that, you know, to realize use value, most things in a capitalist world must first realize their value. The realization of value literally comes before the realization of use value, right? In other words, things must be exchanged before they can be used. And you could think about, for example, I have a picture here of like an artisanal potter or ceramic artist. Um, you could think about how absurd it would be, right, if he was making just for his own use, right? Like, what is it? He's making the 700th pot for a garden he doesn't have because he's been making pots all his time. He doesn't have any time for gardening. So that's not what's happening, right? He's thinking, to read the thought bubble here, right? I hope all these pots will be able to realize their market, their value on the market. That's what he's thinking when he's making them. He's making them for exchange, and they cannot find their use until they've been exchanged. That's the very structure of how the production is happening and how society is working. Um, and we will get to this more later, but I wanted to add just a quick caveat right now, which is, on the other hand, right, in a sense, it has to prove its social use before it realizes its value, right? Because to be sold, that means someone else is buying, and that means someone else has found it useful. Someone else in society has declared the social use of the pot. But we're going to cover that more soon. Okay. So I just wanted to go back to this picture because a lot of these ideas, I think someone mentioned this, these are a lot of review ideas, right? We're adding a layer. There's a lot of review here. A lot of the newer stuff is going to come with money. And I'll just briefly say as a note, I've always found if you're wanting to review chapter 1, reading chapter 2, which is only like 8 pages, is a nice quick way to be like, oh yeah, okay. But just to note again, right? We've covered this image, but capitalism is a system in which independent commodity producers are producing the things we need. They're producing almost entirely for exchange to meet the needs of the rest of society. And they're totally dependent on society, on exchange for their own basic needs and for their raw materials and the various things they need. Um, and so there's this contradiction there. I think this is what I noted before, between this independent private commodity producer and this total social dependence. And that's this sort of strange situation. People are atomized and yet dependent, right? Even though everyone feels like an individual, we live in a society in a way that's actually like more intense than ever before in history. Um, and so what else does that entail? Well, Marx mentioned something that a lot of people have actually taken up from, but I just wanted to mention, which is that he basically says, right, commodity exchange both requires and implies, in a sense, underlying set of laws or legal relationships. I think he calls it like juridical something. And just to list those, right? Legal private ownership. How can you exchange a commodity if you don't own the commodity, right? There's has to be a sense of ownership both for you and for the person you're exchanging it to. There has to be legal recognition of the parties. They have to be seen as subjective, willful agents, subjects in a sense. There has to be mutual consent, and that maybe requires some sort of formal or informal contract structure. So there's this sort of legal structure that is, you could say, we haven't really talked about it much, but is there in this argument and is underneath this argument. And there's a good amount of Marxists who sort of take this point. Sorry, a good amount of Marxists who sort of take this point and run with it if you're interested in it more. But a lot of the laws and the things we think about as sort of like basic sacred parts of what the law is are, you could see, pretty clearly related to commodity exchange and what's needed for commodity exchange. And I did want to just quickly say, like, so what if we didn't have any of these laws? Well, you couldn't do exchange, right? You'd be back in either stage 1 or 2, where there's various different sorts of structures. I wouldn't say they're legal. It's religious, it's family networks, it's also different things, maybe imperial power and violence, that are structuring how you produce and how products move in society. But we wouldn't be in capitalism. It's these laws and this underlying set of juridical relationships that's also central for what exchange is, in a sense. And then I wanted to say last, right? So what final thing is needed to actually bring together, in a sense, more so than the laws, all these independent people? Well, it's money. And we've even seen before that, you know, this permeates popular culture. It's everywhere. So I'm going to play this one again, but we've all seen it, I think, from the previous lecture. If you haven't seen the previous lecture, go back and watch. Want it? I got it. So, right, money is something that has such a prevalence in society. It's invaded a lot of our popular songs, our imagination. It's a key thing that we think about in our life. And it also happens to be the focus of most of the rest of this presentation. And so, oh, there it goes. I wanted to just read, because I love this part, that Marx basically compares money in this chapter. I don't know if other people caught and saw this, to the mark of the beast, something devilish, right? And he reads, I'm going to read from Revelation with one slight modification. All commodities have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast, and that no man might buy or sell save that he had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name, which is later said to be 666. So, right, he's sort of thinking of money as this weird social token that we've all, we already talked about this, right? All commodities have delivered their expression of value to money. That's what makes it money. But that sort of has this power over exchange and how exchange happens. And then he does also have a nice quote there on fetishism. And I want to just read it, right? Hence the magic of money. Human beings now behave in a purely atomistic way in their social production process, and their own relations of production have a thingly form, money, independent of their control and conscious individual action. And you can walk into a store with money and you can demand from society all sorts of things, right? Of course, most of the people doing that demanding are not us. It's people with billions of dollars. Okay. And that's chapter 2. Chapter 3, money or commodity circulation. And I'll say this is really what's different about this layer, right? Is he's done these earlier layers to sort of build up the concept of money around the idea of the commodity. In this one, a little bit in chapter 2, you saw it sort of focuses in on money, but then all of chapter 3 is about money and what it means when we have money as the main sort of mediating force in the market. And so again, with this one, I was going to sort of go through it in stages. It's not a full description of every little stage in the table of contents, but I'm going to say Marx sort of runs through money according to its function, you could say. He's saying, let's look at the different functions that money has. This is also something that's relatively common in economics, although I would say it's much more boring to read that, even if people are bored by this chapter. The first function he notes is measure of value. And the next is means of circulation. And the third is means of payment that we're going to go through. And I do have a little sort of diagram just to sort of walk through how that argument progresses. And so measure of value, right? He starts with money as almost something in your head. He says it's notional. And that's just the way we can use money to look at something and measure its value. we don't actually need real money, right, to do that. We can just look at it and measure it. And in fact, we're doing that all the time. That's part of our daily life because often we know the value of the price, but when we walk around, we're always measuring the value of things in this way. Um, but he does say money can't just stay in our heads. It has to actually come into the world in order for things to actually change hands. And so there it's the means of circulation, real physical money that passes from hand to hand so that the commodities can also pass from hand to hand. Money sort of spiraling around, you could say, the circulation sphere. Um, and then finally, he sort of comes and says, but money doesn't just stay as this sort of intermediary between commodities. It actually comes out into itself. It becomes a need in itself. It becomes a power in itself, you could say, as a means of payment. And here, there's no commodity in the picture, right? You have to pay something. And how do you pay that? In the absolute commodity, in money. And so we're going to cover these three things and sort of the logic that draws from the sort of more notional sense of money, where it's just in our heads, to it being this powerful force on its own. Starting with money as the measure of value. And I'll say first here, right? Measure, probably a term we've thought through a little bit, but you could think of it like a scale, right? Like we're using money to weigh the amount of something in commodities. And we know, I put this sort of thought bubble here, we know from the past lectures, the past reading, that this is actually a necessary part of commodities being commodities, right? Is they need to find a common expression in money. Value needs to have a sort of physical expression for it to be real, socially real. And so in a sense, this measure of value, I like to think of it as almost like an extension of parts of chapter 1. We're saying, yes, money has become a measure of the value of commodities. That's what it is as a general equivalent in the sense. I wanted to sort of just concretize that using some of the pictures from the past, right? But when we say, like I did in the past lecture, 5 coffee drinks, well, that's about $25. The reason that's a good measure of value is because that $25, right? Its own form of value is the expanded form. It can become a lamp, 7 gallons of milk, 360 plastic forks. Anything in the whole world of commodities can be formed, can be created in a sense from that money. And so when you equate the coffee drinks to the money, you are giving it this sort of adequate general form of value. You're saying, I know what the value is, and I'm relating it to the world of commodities through money. And so that's what I like to sort of, I try to visualize things. So I'm going to be developing this visualization throughout the lecture. But I think of the measure of value as almost like a tie. It's a tie that ties a commodity to the greater market and to all the other world of commodities that you see, right? Money measures and it expresses the value in commodities. And by doing this, it ties them to the broader web of commodity exchange. And so as a simple measure, it's not an actual exchange yet. It's just this tie. And then I wanted to use an example from capitalists to sort of get a little bit at what this might look like. So I'll be honest, this just came from some internet sleuthing, but capitalists use money this way all the time. There's many examples of it. And one example I came up with is to measure the value of various commodities in their inventory. So if you go inside, you look measuring inventory values, inventory valuation, you'll find a million of these, I'll call them stupid business how-to web pages. And I pulled just a little quote from one here. I'm going to read. Inventory valuation is the process of assigning a monetary value to your existing inventory. Your inventory is your company's largest asset. So a clear inventory value for each reporting period is essential to valuing your company as a whole. Not only that, but it helps make sure you're setting your product pricing accordingly. So, right, this is like a common practice in running any sort of company to think about inventory value and to use money as a measure of value. And so what does Marx say about it? He says that in this first form, money is at first purely ideal or notional. Although invisible, the value of iron, linen, wheat, and so on does in fact exist in these things. It is represented through their equality with gold, a relation that lives its ghostly life only in the thing's heads, so to speak. The commodity owner must lend their heads his tongue, or hang a tag around their necks in order to communicate the thing's prices to the outside world. Or in the case of this picture here, right, write it on a board. So in all of these forms, money is existing as this notional and as this ideal thing to put an amount, to measure the value in commodities. Um, and I did think a little bit about how to cover this difference between price and value. I'm sure that came up in some groups. I think it's a confusing thing. And hopefully this example helps, but I figure we could just work from this same capitalist example and think through it, right? So what happens when the capitalist inventory can't be sold at its value? And I took a picture here from Bloomberg, right, of Walmart employees share photos of overcrowded back rooms, pallets sitting in store aisles, and boxes blocking access to breastfeeding room as inventory swells. Well, capital responds to this situation by lowering the price, by having a sale, huge clearance sale at Walmart. Everyone come through. And when that's happening, you can believe that there's an analyst sitting at Walmart looking at a computer screen and noting on the one side, the cost to produce this item was $10, but we're having a sale and we're going to sell it for just $6. And we're going to take a loss on that. And in doing that calculation, right, and having both the 10 and the 6 on their screen, they're using the measure of value, both to measure the value directly and to measure the amount of money we can actually get in this moment, the price. And that difference is both part of how they're thinking and how they work. And it's, you could say a part of the structure of price and money as just a measure, as a sort of theoretical measure. And so just to read the Marx quote here, right? Inherent in the price form itself, then, is the potential to have a quantitative incongruity between a commodity's price and its magnitude of value, the potential for its price to deviate from its magnitude of value. This does not reflect poorly on the price form. On the contrary, it is what allows the price form to be adequate for a mode of production whose laws can assert themselves only as averages blindly operating amid lawlessness. And I think this is a hard idea, so I prepared one or two examples for it. And the first, we'll see what people think, is a casino. Right? This is a den of lawlessness, you could say. It's a den of sin and lawlessness. But I just want to walk through it like using the exact analogy here, right? So price, using this analogy, would be you walk into a casino, you don't know how much you're going to walk out with. You don't know how much you're going to lose. You don't know how much you're going to win. It is by definition random, right? It's lawless. It's gambling. That's what it is. But at the same time, the analogy of value here, through the average of everyone, there's a law that's exerted, right? The house always wins. And this is basically what Marx is framing as price and value here, right? Price is a movement that in a sense is lawless, that moves up, that moves down. But through that lawless movement, some sort of law is exerted. And that is, in a sense, value, right? The laws of value. And I've studied a bit of economics. We're gonna do questions at the end. That's okay. Oh.
Like the analogy between like exchange value and temperature, and I think that's exactly what I was trying to get at.
Thanks. Yeah.
Temperature is also like a
Here, let me talk through it, Peter, because they can't hear you. But the analogy we used in the first lecture, which Peter brought up, which is good, is also like temperature, right? That we have a measure of temperature. You can use a thermometer, you get a measure of temperature. If you're a scientist or have studied some science, or just, I guess at this point, probably most college science classes and even below, you know that temperature is actually an average of a bunch of atoms and molecules moving incredibly quickly, some much faster, some much slower, right? And so out of the random movement comes an average that is a very real force. Like we know the use of a hot object versus a cold, right? That's sort of a real thing. So another good example. Thank you. Yeah, and I wanted to use maybe a third example, which is almost not even an example, which is just economics. I've studied this a bit, and I just wanted to argue, I guess, that economics, in a sense, is mostly studying laws that assert themselves only as averages blindly operating amid lawlessness. So when you think of supply and demand, these are huge market phenomenon. A million people saying, I'll buy it for this, I won't buy it for this. In fact, a lot of that happening in people's heads that's been formed into this line, right? That exerts a sort of law. Um, on the other hand, if you're familiar with economics, I won't try to go into too much. On the other hand, here is the sort of microeconomic graph of the firm, right? And basically, the end logic of this is the firms, if there's a firm that's making extra profit, what they call economic profit, other firms will come in, that firm will expand until that disappears. And so the action of all these firms creates a law again that will bring the price back down to its original amount. And so these sort of laws based on averages is a huge part of what economics is. But what I will say is that, well, Marx, I would say, is interested right in the laws and in their internal logic and their sort of historical continuation and conditions. Economists are basically interested in studying this lawlessness as if it's a natural state, as if we've wandered out into nature and look at the lawless dynamics of nature. And then, all using my analysis, I have discovered a law, a natural law of the economy. And so there are these very different perspectives they bring to it. But a lot of these things like supply and demand are actually sort of captured in the way Marx talks about the oscillations of price around value, right? And so I wanted to sort of just note that as a way of saying sometimes you don't need to think too hard about those things because they're there, but they're sort of tackling it from different angles. Okay. So zooming back out, how do commodities actually change hands when money is just a measure of value? Well, the answer is they don't. And I have another little clip here of so if anyone hasn't watched Marx Brothers in their youth, it is fun. But yeah, you need actual money, right, to make the commodity move from one hand to the other. If you don't have any money, you're going to run into a problem in the exchange process. And so that is the second function of money here, money as the means of circulation. And I want to go back to some of the framing that we've been using of, basic truths about human life, things that apply sort of at all times to all human societies, versus how it actually works in history, the historically specific relations between human beings. And in this case, Marx is sort of framing the means of circulation as a type of social metabolism, the way products are moved throughout society. And that is something that is definitively needed in society. In any society, you're going to need a method of moving products, a method of this sort of social metabolism of things, you could say. But commodity circulation on the market is this historically specific way that's done at this time and place. And so that is this framework we're working on. And Marx is basically going to be digging into the historically specific way this is done. And I want to return again to this picture because again, we're going to be taking the perspective of this independent commodity producer producing for exchange, but totally dependent on exchange. And we're going to look at CMC. Excuse me. So imagine our artisan from before, our potter, our ceramicist, wants to buy flowers for his wife. Well, he makes a commodity. He has a commodity, a small green bowl in this case. He sells it for money, converts the C into M, and then takes that money and goes buys, flowers from Trader Joe's. Back to C, M, C, M, C. And so in that process, right, we've seen this sort of the typical use of money as a means of circulation to exchange one commodity for another. And I wanted to just ask what's happened here. And I feel like one of the key things for getting a little bit of what Marx is saying is to see this same process from the perspective of value. And so from the perspective of value, in the first step, right, the artisan has congealed value into a commodity, but he has a piece of value that he has created through his labor, right? That's been congealed. In the second step, does the value disappear? Does it transform? Is it exchanged? No, it goes through a metamorphosis, right? The same value transforms, it leaves behind its material body, it achieves the money form. And that's this sort of the first step, the salta immortale, as we'll talk about it soon. So the same value becomes sort of its true form in money. And then as that true form, it then retransforms into flowers, which is a part of the social labor that's useful to the artisan. And right, even the very idea of that abstract labor as this globule of labor, right? That's what's being revealed here, right? Is that the labor can transform from the thing he produced it in to the thing he needs because it's a part of abstract social labor. And that's this sort of mediation of money. It's value going through its transformations. Um, and so, um, yeah, seen from this perspective of sort of value or the commodity, right? Nothing is really being, I mean, things are being exchanged, but nothing is passing from one hand to the other. Something is just changing its form. And that's where, he's talking about the money form, the value form. He's sort of framing it in this way, trying to get us to see, okay, my labor has produced something, and now it's changing its form to become something I need through this social process of exchange. So looking a little more closely, zooming in on one part, the CM, the commodities salto mortale, moving from through work, value congealed into a commodity to the transformation, the freeing from the material body, achieving the money form. You could say, right, its true soul as value is revealed to the whole world by leaving its mortal coil behind. I think there's a use here for religious imagery. That's why I picked it, right? It's ascending up into the heaven of commodities, becoming money, shedding its mortal body and becoming sort of the soul of value. And there's two things that are happening here. One is, right, sort of what I've been saying so far, the commodity is revealing its true form as value. It's becoming money. But the second is that the commodity is proving its social usefulness, right? That's why Marx calls it the salto mortale, the mortal leap. It's proving that it's actually social useful because it's found a buyer, and thus someone else has said, "I have a use for you." Um, and I wanted to thank Mike from the last lecture, but just saying, right, we should remember always that when we say social usefulness here, we're talking about a distorted version of that term, right? Because social usefulness has now come to mean whoever has money, what they want. That's what social usefulness now means. And so it's become corrupted. It's become topsy-turvy, you could say, where it doesn't have any actual connection to what we would say if we just were any independent thinking person. What is socially useful? Well, maybe working healthcare, maybe et cetera, right? That's not what this is meaning. It's what will get money to come to me. Um, and there's a second part of this step, um, which is that this is sort of the place where a lot of the social characteristics of labor are exerted back onto the laborer. And so I wanted to just play this out. So what happens if you have this commodity you've made, you can't exchange it for money? You're stuck, right? It's not socially useful. You have something, but it's not useful to you. Apparently, it's not useful to society. Your work thus isn't recognized. Uh-oh, how do you buy the things you need to eat? Well, you're going to have to switch work. You're going to have to find a new thing to do, right? To make value that is socially recognized. And it's that process, right? That is in a sense, that's just a sort of example, but if you expand that idea, that's what's driving this social labor transforming, following the changes in demand and the changes in productivity. So this is a slide from lecture, I think lecture 1 or lecture 2, people remember, but right, we talked about how the labor of all of society actually transforms to meet needs. And it's this leap, right? Because this is independent private labor. How is this social force exerted onto it? Well, because it fails to make the leap, or there's some problem and it's salto mortale. And then the people go back and say, well, I guess I better do something else. Or just to say alternatively, right? Maybe it makes the leap and it finds, oh wow, I got 3 times the money I expected. Well, that's not going to last for long because everyone's going to see that and rush to try to make the same thing. So that CM stage is in a sense how all these individual private labors are actually forced to fit the larger social mold. Questions for the end or services in the graph? The yellow in the graph says services. Okay. Okay. Next stage, M to C. This is where value has already transformed into the money form. It's already freed itself from its material body. And now, with sort of absolute authority over the whole world of commodities, it transforms back into what it wants to be, right? And so I picked this image, right? God exerting his absolute authority back onto the earth. And this is that stage. I just want to note that there's a sort of absolute power that comes with having money once you have it. It can become anything. It has this fundamental power. And Marx notes as he goes through this that when we think of exchange this way, when we see the money in the middle, it's essentially different than just direct exchange of products, right? I don't know if anyone else caught that and talked through that in the group space. As like, there's this essential fundamental change that happens when we recognize that money is there in the middle and is playing this role. I'm just going to read the quote that follows from that. On the one hand, we see here how the exchange of commodities bursts the individual and local limits that go with the direct exchange of products, thereby advancing the metabolization of human labor. And you can imagine, right? Just look at our world today. All individual and local limits have been burst, right? We live in a global, crazy system that can literally be seen from space that's advanced the metabolization of human nature. On the other hand, a whole network of natural social connections develops through commodity circulation, one that the human actors involved can't control. And so this is I took this picture we've used in a last lecture, I think. This is the dynamics that are happening behind our backs, in a sense, that are controlling society. And Marx does explain this, I think, in this first moment in a pretty simple way, but one that I think is useful and helpful, right? Where he just basically says, let's say you have a product, you want to sell it, you want someone to buy it. Well, to buy it, they need money. How did they get money? Because they must have sold something, right? But then how did that person buy it? And so on, and so on, and so on, right? So you get tied into this infinite link of someone else needs money for you to actually make your sale, but you don't know who that person is. You don't know where they are. All the individual local bonds have been bursted. And so your social action becomes dependent on this web of other social relations that are people's private relations, right? They're not social relations. You have no right to look into them, et cetera. They're private relationships that are happening behind your back. And this is true for everyone who lives in our society, right? So much of what we do is dependent on other people's private relations that we don't really have any inkling into. We don't really see what's going on. And in this sense, commodity circulation is essentially different than the direct exchange or barter of products, right? In both of these cases, it's doing something that when we're just talking about exchange of like, the tailor goes to the linen maker and they trade their products directly, none of this is happening. But with the introduction of money and commodity circulation, it is. And I wanted to talk through basically this idea of circulation. And one of the things Marx pulls out, right, is that money is never disappearing from this process. It just keeps on chugging. So to take his own example, right, if the farmer sells their wheat in order to buy the linen, that linen is then consumed by the farmer. Now the weaver has money. They buy the Bible and they consume it. They read through it. Now the drunk has money. They buy the schnapps. They consume it. Now the distiller has money. Maybe he goes and buys our little green pot. Now that's consumed. Now the potter might go buy the flowers, right? In each case, the commodity is just making one little jump. But the same money has never disappeared. It's just passing from one hand to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. It just keeps chugging on. And this is what bursts, right? This is what bursts those local connections. And to read sort of what I would say is Marx's most dramatic version of saying this, circulation explodes the temporal, spatial, and individual limits that go with the direct exchange of products. And so hopefully that image I chose of the sort of spinning dollars has some resonance now that we've gone through it. And I did want to note, we're going to talk a little bit about it later, but not too much, but one of the things Marx does note here, which we had an interesting discussion about in my group, is that this introduces the possibility of crisis, right? Because there's no longer a necessity that when you try to sell something, there'll be a buyer. And there's all these limits are broken, and thus they might get out of balance. And then what happens? Crisis. Um, and so then he spends what I would personally call an inordinate amount of time basically answering the question, so how much money is permanently needed in the sphere of circulation? If other people have done the reading, they will know what I'm talking about. It's like we go through this, we go through that. Da, 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 da. I personally do not find this question immensely interesting, but I see its logical purpose. And I just want to basically add that this equation that he comes to, and I think was relatively around in his time, although it was much contested, has since then become just sort of a logical de facto true statement in economics. So if anyone studied economics, this equation of M, the money supply times the velocity or the circulation, must be equal to the prices times the total quantity of things produced, is considered just by definition logically true in pretty much all economics these days. So I hope we don't need to go too deep into it. If you want, you can look it up. But yeah, this is sort of logically true. And then the question that comes up that is still contested is what does this equation imply in terms of causality? And so Marx has his statement on this, and people still talk about this. Does this mean, look, I see prices on one side, I see money on the other. Does it mean when we put new money in, the prices go up? Um, and that's sort of one of the common frames. And that is still a question that people are asking in economics nowadays. And Marx does answer it. He says, are prices determined by the amount of money in circulation? No. Um, and I'm going to just sort of say, and I think this is really the core of his argument. He's basically like, go back and reread the book, right? Haven't we been talking about what is regulating the seemingly accidental relationship between commodities when they're exchanged? Didn't we start with that seeming accidentality, but said, oh, there's some inner consistency? I know you won't be able to read these slides, but if you've seen the past lectures, you might recognize the images. There's some inner consistency to how things are priced. Actually, that inner consistency reflects the amount of labor, the amount of time, the amount of human effort that went into them. That's because all that labor is sort of considered as one big social labor because value has both that content and that form. And that's a specific way that society exists nowadays. It's not true at all times in all places. And so he's sort of saying, like, we've done this argument to show that value and thus in many, in most cases, prices are not determined by the amount of money in circulation. Um, I will say that still leaves open the question of sort of like fiat currencies, no tie to gold. I'm sure that came up for some people. Um, I think I'll just note a couple things about it in the coming slides. And I don't think this is something that's use digging super deep in your groups, but if you did, it's great. I sort of like that stuff too. But just to take recent history has shown that this is just definitively not correct, at least in general, right? So in two recent cases, the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID shock here, we had the Federal Reserve push huge amounts of money out into the economy. I mean, beyond what we can really imagine. And what happened when it did that? Well, on the one hand, a dropping velocity of money. So this is the graph from the Fed of the velocity of money. You can see these sort of huge dramatic drops. You put a bunch of money out there, well, it doesn't circulate as much, you know? So it turns out there's more flexibility in that equation than you need. I'll also say at the same time in both of these moments, you saw actually deflationary pressure at the time this was first done, right? Because the economy's slowing down and thus people are sailing, they're doing, lowering prices. So you can easily find many of these historical examples that sort of show, no, you can push money out there, it can increase velocity, it can do all sorts of things, but it doesn't necessarily lead to inflation. And sorry to stick on this topic a little longer, but I did want to say, we took this picture from earlier, right, of how money sort of connects the coffee drinks to the rest of all the world of commodities. Well, I wanted to sort of say in the world of fiat currencies, this may be a little less true in this sense, but it is still in a sense true, right? It's a very similar image that we could get if we were looking at how basically the US dollar is chained by the Federal Reserve and its policy to a basket of goods, what we think of as inflation, right? The consumer price index, which is basically a balanced basket of housing, transportation, education and communication, apparel, food and beverages, medical care, recreation, and other goods and services. So every other good in the economy put into a basket, measured, and then the Fed says we are chaining the dollar.
This image and this image have a certain parallel. And so instead of the actual value of the currency, in this case, it's just paper money, it doesn't have actual value like gold does. It's the weight of the Federal Reserve that's has all these rules that are regulating and chaining the value of the dollar to exactly the same, a basket of all the other commodities in the whole world of commodities. And that's backed up, on the one hand by the independent power of the Federal Reserve, on the other hand by just, the U.S. economy, U.S. global power. And so that in a sense is sort of this parallel form or structure. And so to move on, so what happens when a fiat currency loses its tie to value? Trying to look at it maybe from the other side, right? What happened if this chain is broken? And there's actually a bunch of historical examples of this. I'm only going to go through 4 here, but there's Zimbabwe. That happened relatively recently, 2007, 2008. Daily inflation peaked there at prices doubling every 24 hours. And that ended with an abandonment of the currency and dollarization, basically the economy using the American dollar as a currency inside itself. Argentina, relatively similar. There's sort of been recurring issues here. The big one was in 1989, but it's sort of returning a little bit now. But inflation back then was above 3,000% annually. And that led to pretty significant currency reforms and also just like an undercurrent of dollars, again, American dollars being used throughout the economy instead of the local currency. The classic sort of historical example for this exact thing, the collapse of a fiat currency, is Germany post-World War I, the Weimar Republic. And there was peak monthly inflation of about 20,000%. This is like basically full collapse of the currency in all of these cases on some level. And, I think famously at this time, if you looked into it, people were using the banknotes as wallpaper, as insulation. They were using them more just for their literal heft and weight as paper than for the value they had. And that ended with the introduction of a new currency that was tied back to gold. So they had to abandon the currency that had collapsed. Hungary, after World War II or towards the end of World War II, similar, very, very, very high inflation, prices doubling every 15 hours. And that also ended in a currency collapse and post-World War II, just the replacement of a new currency. And so when these fiat currencies fail, it's a disaster for the economy. In each of these cases, I don't think I emphasize that enough. In each of these cases, economic disaster and collapse. You cannot, have a modern capitalist economy. Money just disappears or loses its function. Things start going pretty badly pretty quick. It's an essential part of the economy. But then money ends up getting reestablished, often through some sort of, introduction of a new currency that is reliable, i.e. the US dollar in a couple of cases, right? Or the reintroduction of a new currency that's somehow more definitively tied to gold. And so based on this, I wanted to just sort of present this idea of sort of like the layers. I like the layers of money in capitalism. So I have here, right, at the bottom layer, the foundation, gold as money, the precious metals. And then above that, maybe there's currency money that's well linked to value. A good example here, right, is the US dollar in the current global order for the past handful of decades. On top of that, there's fiat currencies that don't have this strong link to value. There's credit money or debt money. People are using basically debt slips or credit slips as if they're money and trading them as money in a variety of places, up even back in Marx's time. In fact, this is part of what I sort of want to argue here, right? Is like sometimes people take Marx's idea of like gold, money must be gold, it must have a real value, as if that's like the linchpin. But I think even though it's really important in how he develops the argument, he actually is sort of developing this idea of layers of money. And even in his time, right, credit money, debt money, fiat currency, all these things were relatively common things. But money as a whole was this sort of layered structure. And when a fiat currency collapsed, as we saw in these past, the past slide, the past examples, something else would stand in as the new currency. And ultimately, at the very bottom and foundation, you could say that's gold, or something that's functioning very similar to gold that has a real value. And so he is sort of thinking of money as this sort of all these layers that are in a sense relating one to the other. And if one fails, maybe you can shift back to a sort of previous one. Okay, so enough on that. Sorry to such a long detour there, but just to sum up what we covered here, right? We talked about money as a measure of value, which is the thing that ties the commodity to the market, to the world, the web of commodity exchange. And then money as a means of circulation, the actual, motion of money through the economy that's actually moving commodities from hand to hand, while money just keeps moving and twisting and turning and circulating within the market. And from there, we are going to jump to money as means of payment. And the first slide here, this is a picture of I believe the first stock exchange ever. I'm pretty sure, in Amsterdam. So the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. And this is just sort of, following Marx's own argument here, right? He's basically saying where there's regular business, where the same people are buying and selling the same things again and again, month and month and month, where a lot of that business might have all sorts of sort of temporal problems. Like maybe, you need to buy the seeds to plant your field or to plant a bunch of fields, but the crop doesn't come for another 8 months, or you need to pay for the merchant vessel and the crew, even though the results of the trade don't come until a couple years later when the ship comes back from Indonesia or whatever. I mean, this is Amsterdam, right? So it's sort of a high Dutch colonial period right now. And so in all these cases, right, there's a lot of business that's happening. There's temporal issues. There's a lot of regularity of business. There's a lot of people becoming creditor and debtor around the same time. And in this situation, Marx is basically saying what develops is money as a means of payment. So you'll have all sorts of common structures and institutions that basically say, I actually don't have the money to pay you today, but I'll pay you in a week. Or, I'll pay you once the season is over, plus 10%, whatever. There's all sorts of basically structures for using contracts, for using money, I guess saying you'll pay money at a different time than the commodity actually changes hands. And so this is basically institutions that go beyond money as a simple means of circulation. And instead there's, promises to pay, there's contracts, there's creditors, and there's debtors. And that is what happened in Amsterdam. And so out of that, what you get is money becoming a need in itself, the absolute commodity. And so, people who are searching for money as their end in life, what they need is money, what they need to pay their bills is money, the sort of merchant or even like lender figure, these sorts of things. To give some examples from today, I have 3 here, drawing from sort of, the capitalist side of things, capitalist business. Still, money as a means of payment is very common. And so one example is sort of like large fixed orders. So let's say you're ordering like a large machine, or actually let's just, paying for a whole building. These sorts of things, they're often paid in installments. So you might pay the first part, before even any of the materials are delivered to the site. And you might only pay the last part once it's installed and actually working, operating. And so this is a way of using money as a means of payment and having like different dates in which certain amounts of money has to be paid. Another example that's, I think, pretty common is bookstores. There's a relatively common structure when bookstores order books, like, a bunch of new books that have just been published, that they don't have to pay for them for 90 or even 120 days. And the idea there, right, is that by that time, they'll have sold some of these new books, and so this sort of facilitates them being able to buy and then sell them and then pay later. So that's a common structure within bookstores. Somewhat similar is Amazon. I don't know if anyone here has ever, sold on Amazon, but basically when you sell on Amazon, right, if you're using their service, you provide the goods to them, and they're stored in a distribution center or a warehouse, and you aren't paid for those goods until a week, I think 7 days after the product is delivered to the house. So it could be stored in a warehouse for a year and you would get no pay, even though you've delivered your product to Amazon. So that's obviously, has to do with the sort of market power of Amazon, the power they hold. But that's also, again, money as a means of payment, right? It's the division between when money is paid and when commodities are actually moving. And money becomes just sort of like a payment service. So that's 3 examples of how this is done in capitalism, sort of through capitalists, by capitalists. But it's also very common in our own daily life now. I think it's just like a part of our daily life. And so, an obvious example there is rent. Most of us here probably pay rent. There, right, you have a contract that's telling you need to pay this much money every month to stay in your home. Money is a means of payment. It's a bill you have. Similar is taxes, right? If you end up doing your TurboTax here, if that's what you do, and you see at the end, oh damn, I got $4,600 to pay. You can't pay that in coats, right? You can't pay that in linen. You need to pay that in money, that the means of payment. And so the other graph here is credit card delinquency. So just showing, also credit card debt, right? You get a bill that you have to pay in money for your credit card debt, and the delinquency of those payments in recent time has been going up a little bit. But in all of these cases, just to note, right, what's changed is that money has become a direct need in order to pay our bills. So not to buy things, not to buy use values. We need money as a means of payment to pay rent, to pay taxes, to pay other bills. And so just to say it again, right, you can't pay your taxes in coats or linen. You can't pay your rent in pottery. You have to use money as a means of payment. You can't just use a use value. And so money has actually sort of escaped use value, you could say. It's come into its own. It's become a need on its own. And there's also a sort of totalizing function here, right? So because we all need money to pay taxes, to pay rent, to pay bills, we all have to definitively participate in the capitalist commodity economy, right? We need to sell things to get money because we need money itself. We don't just need a use value. We're not just exchanging. We're not just, exchanging for another use value. We're exchanging to get money so that we can pay our bills. And that's sort of a forced integration, you could say, into this larger system, because you need money as a means of payment. Just wanted to finish the image here, right? So we had money as the measure of value, tying the commodity to the whole web of commodities, to the market. We have money as the means of circulation, actually moving the commodities around from hand to hand. But now above that, we have money as the means of payment. Here there's contracts, there's all sorts of longer term deals and relationships. And in order to facilitate those relationships, in a sense, right, the content of those contracts is money payments. It's money being paid on its own as money to others to fulfill obligations or whatever else. And so that's, in a sense, above circulation. There's these hordes of money, there's these established relationships and contracts, and money is used as a means of payment. And so like we've been saying, I pulled this Andy Warhol set of paintings, right? In this form, basically, money has become something new. It's become, I think Marx says, the absolute commodity. It's no longer just a measure of value. It's no longer just a tool for circulation. It stands on its own as the very incarnation of value, as the absolute commodity. And it rises above just commodity exchange and becomes a need in itself, a part of our life, a driving desire, And so money, in the course of this sort of logical process, in the course of how Marx has laid it out, right? It starts as a sort of subsidiary, even just a mental role. But it has now risen, as it then gets used in exchange. And then as people realize, oh, it has this absolute power and we can use it itself as a means of payment, and it comes into life. It becomes rent payment. It becomes taxes. It becomes all the bills, Money ends up coming into its own as this sort of absolute commodity, as the means of payment. And I had this last slide here. After money has achieved an independent power as the absolute commodity, what comes next? Well, capital, right? Money increasing itself, money striving after itself, growing, money becoming more money. And that's where we're going to end up going next. So chapter 4, the transformation of money into capital. No, we're not actually going to cover this today. This is for next lecture. So it's actually the end. And yeah, feel free to ask any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Any questions?
I did just want to ask, like, what are your opinions on, like, some of the, like, how this other theories that have come into prominence, like the chartless school, which actually alleges that money, what we call money, even if money is the absolute commodity, that's its description under capitalism, it's more money. The concept of money existed before capitalism as basically a creature of the state. If you look at the work by Michael Hudson, he basically proved, like, archaeology has proved that what we call money originated in, like, the early palace economies of ancient Sumer as basically like a means to help them plan, like, the palace economy. And it was only then started to be used as like a, started to be used as like a medium of exchange later. And this theory also alleges that money technically originally represented like a debt to a state, and certain objects become money just by, the state levying taxation or like paying its debt, paying its obligations through money. So what do you think of like these theories, and how well do they fit into this framework?
Yeah, thanks. I think first I'll say, and we'll see this in, I think, in coming chapters, but also a little bit in this chapter and in my own examples, right? Marx is very aware that money and even things like interest, loans, debt, credit, money making more money exists long before what he would sort of classically call capitalism. And in fact, we'll see this a bit next chapter, but as a sort of a preview, right? There's all sorts of writings you can find from this period where it exists that are very interesting, of people like condemning it as the worst thing ever. Aristotle, Martin Luther, Jesus, in a sense, you could say. Various people saying this sort of money lending is disgusting and asocial. And so it definitely existed long before capitalism, both money and even these like early forms of what Marx is going to say, early forms of capital, like interest-bearing money. And so I would say, I think he recognizes that historical truth already, but he's more thinking through money's significance and role and sort of social power in capital. And so he would say, well, if you go to a feudal society where there's tons of debt, where the government is getting into debt with big merchants, you still can't take money and go to a peasant and be like, can I buy your farm? Because the farm is a right. And the peasant's like, I don't need money. I don't use money to buy the things I need. So like it doesn't have the sort of social power that it does, and we're talking about it here. And so like the idea of like, when I went back to those first slides of the different forms, right? The content of value and the form of value don't necessarily apply yet in these situations, because money is sort of existing, and even interest and stuff is existing within and controlled by previous social formations, and in fact, often condemned by them in various ways. So yeah. For people who aren't familiar with that, there's a ton of literature on money and development on money. So yeah, it's interesting stuff if you're into it. But any other questions?
Um, can you talk a little bit more about the imaginary price, or, the things that don't have value because there's no labor in them, like honor, uncultivated land, those examples. And my group thought about like branding and just all kinds of stuff that fits into that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I like that section too, and I'm realizing it's not in the lecture at all. But yeah, so one of the things Marx also mentions when he's talking about money as the measure of value is that in the same way, right, money and price can be different. Money as a price can start being assigned to things that don't have a value. And I think that's something that we're very familiar with. You can sort of buy anything. You can pay someone enough, they will give up their honor. He tell you, just ask any lawyer. No, I don't know. So yes, there's, and in a sense, even a piece of art, like we've had a lot of art in this presentation, right? The price of that piece of art has to do with its uniqueness, its authenticity, these sorts of things. It's clearly not valuable in the way Marx is talking about it, but a price has been assigned to it. And so I think it comes from this same sort of dynamic that hopefully was made clear here, but how price and sort of money as a measure of value doesn't just capture value, but can also capture differences or assign prices to things that don't technically have value. And yeah, I think it's really interesting to think through that, and definitely lots of things in our lives today that you could, in a sense, buy or sell that are not strictly produced and don't strictly have value.
We were curious though, like, are they still commodities? Do we still say that they have value? Just those kind of questions.
Yeah. I don't think I have, sorry. So the questions were, with these things, are they still commodities? Do they still have value? And I don't think I'm going to give a definitive answer on that. I'll say that I think there's probably some debate, but an easy medium, I would say, right, is that many things are commodified. And that's a term, like they're treated like commodities and they, in a sense, behave like commodities, even if in some strict sense, they probably don't perfectly fit into the model, you could say. And that's clearly true. And so, yeah. Yeah, yes and no. And somewhere in between yes and no is the answer most people will give.
This is a little more of a comment than a question, so apologies in advance. I just want to say, when talking about Indigenous people or anthropologists, please take what anthropologists say about Indigenous people with a huge, huge grain of salt. We were known for tricking anthropologists and giving them false information about ourselves so that we could keep our secrets about how we exchange what the values of things are to us. Why, like, secret? Especially around like blankets or things like how non-native people think of wampum. Just definitely like look for other sources from Indigenous people on those topics if possible.
Yeah, thank you for that. I did. So, and most of them were semi-confirmed, although some challenged.
Hey, thanks so much. I was just curious, this is a little bit out of the, like, not on the book itself, but I'm just wondering if you could just speak to something that I've seen, like with people on the right who are obsessed with getting back onto the gold standard. And there's this like obsession, I think will probably become more mainstream, or is becoming more mainstream, that reduces the problem of capitalism to fiat currency and it's not rooted in gold, da da da. Anyway, I'm just wondering if you could just, from your view, kind of speak to that and how that relates to the text in a little bit of detail. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, excuse me, that like this is maybe a little more personal, but when I see all the array of different, like some people saying we're going to go back to gold, the gold price tripling recently, all these sort of silly things. Some people saying the US dollar can buy anything. We can print as much as we want. And it'll, all these different takes. It's interesting to see the range. And I think they sort of capture this idea of layers, and people are confused by sort of what money is and what it will do. But I think what Marx is trying to sort of point at is that it's sort of a fundamental part of the value logic And if one layer fails, something will reexert itself through almost definitely some form of extreme crisis in society. Because if you don't have money, so much of society as it works in everyday, parlance and everyday actions will not function. I think that the turn to gold, I don't know, like the return to it. I don't know if I have anything smart to say on it, to be honest, but it's clearly, they want to escape the government, maybe, although the gold has always been regulated by the government. I'll just say, I mean, the US has been on the gold standard for most of its history up until 1971, and then briefly FDR called it off too, actually. But for most of that, there were a bunch of laws about, like, people were not allowed to own gold in bulk. It was, you had to use the Federal Reserve Bank. So there, having a gold standard and gold currency doesn't escape the state. I don't know. I think it's an interesting question that I don't have a good answer to. Yeah. Any other questions?
I'll toss one in here. Yeah, there's obviously, like, knowing the context of dialectical materialism and such, like we like contradictions as a driving force of history or historical development. Like these earlier stages of commodity production are like these archetypal societies have contradictions within them. And that's sort of the like inevitable part category that you differentiate from like our historical moment. And it's just, I don't know whether the book will get further into crisis. I'm sure we will, but crisis as sort of contradictions exploding. I was wondering if you could speak a little more to like, what is it about money that, is it like the acceleration of these contradictions, or like how heightening, like, could you speak to what is it about money that like causes these contradictions that are already there to just get worse, or how do they change?
Yeah. I'm going to switch to this slide because I think it sort of gets the closest I got to that. But yeah, I mean, Marx is basically, there's a number of ways he talks about money and the contradiction of money, but one of them would be, I think a classic one, right, is that there's this starting contradiction between use value and exchange value. And in money, that contradiction has found its, actual material opposite. So commodities are use values that have value. Money is value in itself. And so the value has found an external body. And thus that contradiction has in a sense been really escaped, you could say. But now it's a new contradiction in the world, which is, well, now value and use value and these things may not align. They may not align in time and space, right? They've escaped the bounds of these early forms. And so this would be like the actual difference between, let's say the amount of money people say a house is worth in 2008 and what it ends up actually being worth after the crisis or something, right? That's in a sense a contradiction between use value and exchange value. But now expressed in this realm where money has escaped use value and is doing its own speculation and then is drawn back through crisis. And I do think, I'll just note, I've always found it interesting to note that in Marx, crisis is both crisis, obviously, but it also is actually a way of re-exerting rules, right? So it sort of has, it itself is a somewhat contradictory concept in Marx, where a crisis is often, the opposite of a crisis. A crisis is the re-exertion of law or something. And so, yes, I think that's a useful way to think about it, of like these contradictions expanding and becoming, in a sense, more open to even broader gaps and stuff that will eventually be brought back together through crisis. And you could think of this, right, like that, blind averages operating amid lawlessness. Well, sometimes those averages re-exert themselves in a lawless world by cataclysm or something. And so that's, I find that useful to think about crisis. I think, yeah, maybe I'll stop there. I don't know if that fully answers your question.
No,
but
yeah, that's perfect.
Any other questions or anything on Zoom too, if you want to raise your hand or, okay. Okay, well, let's call it. Thanks everyone for coming, and keep up with the discussion groups. Yeah, see you relatively soon, I think, the lecture 4. You got the recording?